A dog starts barking at the white groom right at the wedding. The bride decides to find out the reason and makes a shocking discovery that changes everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Aisha stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the sleek, pearl-colored dress she had chosen for her bridal shower. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric over her hips, her reflection revealing both excitement and apprehension. She wanted everything to be perfect, not just for the wedding, but for the life she envisioned afterward. The house she had worked so hard to buy, the business she had built from the ground up, and the love she had finally found after years of heartbreak. All of it felt like pieces of a dream coming together. Yet, despite the warm glow of the room and the sparkle of the diamond on her finger, a shadow lingered in her mind. Beside her, Ska lay with her head resting on her paws, her deep brown eyes fixed intently on Aisha. The German Shepherd had been Aisha's constant companion since she was a teenager. She had found Sky as a shivering, malnourished puppy abandoned on the side of the road, barely clinging to life. Aisha had wrapped her in a blanket, carried her home, and nursed her back to health. In the years that followed, Sky had repaid that kindness with unwavering loyalty. She was more than a pet. She was family. Aisha bent down and stroked the dog's head, feeling the warmth of her fur beneath her fingertips. "What do you think, girl? Am I making the right choice?" Sky's ears twitched and she lifted her head slightly, sniffing the air before pressing closer to Aisha's legs. It wasn't the reaction Aisha had hoped for. She smiled nervously, brushing it off. Later that evening, as Aisha sat at a dinner table surrounded by friends and laughter, she couldn't help but notice the way Sky hovered near her, even in a room full of strangers. The dog's eyes followed her every movement, especially when Denise leaned in to whisper something in her ear. Denise was charming as always, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled, but Sky's gaze never left him. Denise had swept into her life like a fairy tale prince. They had met at a charity gala where Aisha had donated art pieces from her gallery. He had admired her work and, within minutes, had captivated her with his easy confidence and wit. Their romance had been a whirlwind, filled with late-night dinners, spontaneous weekend getaways, and promises of forever. But even in those early days, there had been moments that left Aisha uneasy. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in tone when he talked about race, jokes that felt just a little too sharp. She had ignored those moments, convincing herself they were misunderstandings. After all, people grew up differently, and Denise had never known what it meant to fight for acceptance in the way Aisha had. His family came from wealth and tradition, his father a powerful attorney, his mother the head of a prestigious charity. They were polite, even welcoming, but their politeness had always felt calculated, like a mask covering something less pleasant. When Aisha had first met Denise's parents, she had been determined to make a good impression. She wore her best dress, brought a thoughtful gift, and spoke carefully, aware of how quickly she could be judged. Denise's mother, Eleanor, had greeted her with a forced smile and commented on her unique style, while his father, Richard, had given her a brief handshake before turning his attention back to his phone. That night, as Aisha and Denise drove home, she had voiced her concerns, but Denise had brushed them off, calling his parents old-fashioned and promising they'd come around. Aisha wanted to believe him. Sky had been there too, sitting in the back seat, staring silently out the window. Even then, she had seemed tense, her body rigid and alert. As the wedding approached, Aisha tried to drown out the doubts. She buried herself in preparations, choosing flowers and finalizing guest lists, but the tension never fully left her. She noticed it most when Sky was in the room. The dog's presence had always been comforting, but now it felt like a warning. Sky's reactions to Denise grew sharper. She would tense up when he touched Aisha, sometimes even letting out a low growl. Denise laughed it off, but Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that Sky saw something she didn't. One night, as Denise was helping her review seating charts, Sky had suddenly lunged forward, barking sharply at him. Denise had stepped back, startled and then angry. "What the hell is wrong with that dog?" he demanded. Aisha had quickly pulled Sky away, but she had felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "She's just protective." Protective? Or crazy? Denise's voice softened, but the edge in it lingered. "Maybe she's not adjusting to all the changes. You should think about what's best for us once we're married." Later, as Aisha lay in bed with Sky curled up at her feet, those words echoed in her mind. What's best for us? The implication hadn't been lost on her. She had worked hard to build her life, to create stability, and now she was being asked to question whether a part of that life still fit. The next morning, as Aisha sifted through the final legal paperwork for the wedding, she paused at a document Denise had insisted she sign. It detailed the merging of their assets and the transfer of her house into joint ownership. She hesitated, her pen hovering above the paper. Sky, who had been lying at her feet, suddenly sat up, her ears pricked forward. She stared at the papers, then at Aisha, and let out a low whine. Aisha put the pen down and reached for Sky, her chest tightening. "I'm just being paranoid," she whispered, but even as she said it, her pulse quickened. Over the next few days, the tension in the house grew. Denise tried to reassure her, brushing aside her concerns, but every time he touched her shoulder or leaned in for a kiss, Sky inserted herself between them. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, Aisha felt like she was balancing on a knife's edge. She wanted to believe in the man she was marrying, in the love they shared, but the doubts, those nagging, persistent doubts, were growing louder. Sky never left her side. Wherever Aisha went, the dog followed, her eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. Aisha wanted to tell herself it was just nerves, that Sky was reacting to the stress of the wedding, but deep down she knew better. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she reached down to stroke Sky's fur. The dog looked up at her with those deep, knowing eyes. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" Sky didn't move, but her steady presence was answer enough. Aisha closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. In the darkness, her doubts grew sharper, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Aisha's bedroom, bathing the room in a golden glow. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her phone as she scrolled through last-minute wedding arrangements. The wedding was just 2 days away, and the list of unfinished tasks seemed endless. Dresses needed final adjustments, flowers had to be confirmed, and seating charts required a final review. Yet, despite the flurry of activity, Aisha's mind kept drifting back to the previous night, the papers Denise had urged her to sign and Sky's reaction. Sky lay at her feet, ears perked and eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting an intruder at any moment. Her steady, watchful gaze made Aisha's chest tighten. "Calm down, girl," Aisha murmured, stroking the dog's fur. "Everything's fine." But was it? Denise had been distant lately. His calls were shorter, his texts less frequent. He claimed it was stress from the wedding preparations, but Aisha couldn't shake the sense that something else was going on. Even during their last dinner date, he had seemed preoccupied, constantly checking his phone and avoiding her gaze. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Denise, dressed sharply in a navy suit, holding a bouquet of red roses. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, stepping inside and kissing her cheek. "I thought I'd surprise you." Aisha forced a smile and accepted the flowers, but Skye immediately rose to her feet, her body tense. She stood between them, her ears back and her tail stiff. "Seriously?" Denise muttered, glaring at the dog. "What's her problem?" "She's just being protective," Aisha said quickly, pulling Skye back. "It's probably the stress of the wedding." Denise shook his head. "You're always making excuses for that dog. Maybe she's not as harmless as you think." The comment stung, but Aisha brushed it off, focusing instead on the wedding plans Denise had come to finalize. He spread out papers on the table, flipping through them with an air of impatience. "We need to go over the finances one last time," he said, tapping a pen against the documents. "I've added a few clauses to make things easier after the wedding, consolidating everything so we don't have to deal with separate accounts." Aisha's stomach twisted. "I thought we'd already settled this." "We did," Denise said quickly. "This is just a formality. You trust me, right?" The word trust lingered in the air like smoke. Skye growled softly, and Aisha squeezed her eyes shut, trying to drown out the sound. She wanted to trust him. She needed to. But later that night, as she reviewed the papers alone, doubt gnawed at her. Something about the legal language seemed overly complicated. She highlighted sections she didn't understand, intending to ask Denise for clarification, but the thought of confronting him made her stomach churn. Skye rested her head on Aisha's lap, a low whine escaping her throat. "What are you trying to tell me?" Aisha whispered. The following day, Aisha met with her best friend, Kendra, at a small cafe. As soon as Aisha mentioned the financial paperwork, Kendra's expression darkened. "Girl, are you serious?" Kendra said, leaning closer. "You're putting everything you own into a shared account? Don't you think that's risky?" "It's normal for married couples," Aisha said defensively. "Normal for who?" Kendra snapped. "You barely know this man's family, and from what you've told me, they're not exactly rooting for this marriage. What if they're planning something?" Aisha opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. The doubts she had been trying to bury came rushing back. "Look, I'm not trying to scare you," Kendra said, softening. "I just want you to be careful. And don't ignore that dog of yours. Animals sense things we can't." When Aisha returned home, Skye greeted her at the door, tail wagging but eyes serious. Denise's car was already in the driveway, and Aisha found him in the kitchen, pouring wine. "Hey, you're back," he said, flashing her a smile. "I thought we could relax tonight." Aisha wanted to let her guard down, to sink into the comfort of his arms and forget her fears. But as they sat down to dinner, Skye refused to leave her side. She stayed under the table, her body pressed against Aisha's legs. Halfway through the meal, Denise reached for Aisha's hand. "I know this has all been overwhelming," he said, "but after the wedding, everything will settle down. We'll finally be a team." Aisha forced a smile, but Skye's growl made her pull her hand away. Denise's jaw tightened. "That dog is getting out of control," he snapped. "Maybe it's time to think about sending her somewhere, just for a while." Aisha's heart sank. "You're not serious." "I am," he said firmly. "She's unpredictable. What if she snaps at someone during the wedding?" Aisha stood up, pushing her chair back. "Skye isn't the problem here, Denise. She's trying to protect me." "Protect you? From what?" His voice rose, sharp and accusing. "Me? My family? Is that what you think?" "I don't know." The words burst out before Aisha could stop them, but I'm not ignoring her instincts. Denise stared at her, his face unreadable, and for the first time Aisha saw something in his eyes that made her shiver. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. That night, Aisha locked the bedroom door. Sky lay curled up at her feet, her breathing slow but alert. Aisha couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed every red flag she had ignored, every instinct she had silenced. In the early hours of the morning, she woke to the sound of Sky growling. The dog stood at the door, her body rigid. Aisha's pulse quickened. She pressed her ear to the door and heard voices, Denise's and his mother's. "She's already signed most of it," Eleanor was saying. "One more push and we'll have it all." Aisha stumbled back, her heart pounding. Sky pressed against her legs, ready. Everything made sense now. The papers, the sudden push for joint accounts, the growing tension. It had never been about love. It had been about control. Aisha sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around Sky as tears burned her cheeks. She wasn't safe, not with them. But she had Sky, and Sky wouldn't let them win. The day of the wedding arrived with a brightness that seemed at odds with the weight pressing on Aisha's chest. She stood in the dressing room of the church, surrounded by mirrors and flowers, her heart pounding as she stared at her reflection. The lace veil framed her face, delicate and ethereal, but she felt anything but serene. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Denise, who had slipped it onto her arm just the night before with a lingering kiss. Sky sat by the door, her ears alert and eyes fixed on the hallway beyond. Aisha could feel the tension radiating from her, as though the dog could sense the undercurrent of fear running through her veins. The conversation she had overheard 2 nights ago still echoed in her mind. Eleanor's voice, sharp and calculating, had confirmed every suspicion Aisha had tried to ignore. She had spent the last 48 hours in a haze of disbelief and dread, pretending to move forward with the wedding while desperately trying to figure out what to do. She wanted to run. She wanted to grab Sky, tear off the dress, and disappear. But how could she? Guests were already arriving, filling the pews with polite laughter and whispered gossip. Her parents had flown in from across the country, beaming with pride at the thought of their daughter marrying into wealth and security. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. 5 minutes, came the wedding planner's voice through the door. Aisha took a deep breath, forcing her hands to steady as she smoothed the fabric of her dress. She needed to be calm. She couldn't let anyone see the storm raging inside her. Sky whined softly, pressing her head against Aisha's leg. "I know," Aisha whispered, stroking her fur. "I know." Moments later, the doors to the chapel swung open, and Aisha stepped inside. The hush that fell over the crowd sent chills down her spine. She tried to focus on the faces smiling back at her, but her eyes were drawn to Denise, who stood at the altar with an expression so carefully composed that it only deepened her unease. Sky walked beside her, wearing a floral collar that matched Aisha's bouquet. She had insisted the dog be a part of the ceremony despite Denise's protests. Now she was grateful for the decision. As she approached the altar, Sky suddenly stopped. The dog let out a low growl, deep and guttural, that rippled through the silent church like a crack of thunder. Gasps spread through the crowd. Aisha froze, her heart racing as she looked down at Sky. The dog's fur bristled, her eyes locked on Denise. Denise's smile faltered. "What the hell is this?" he hissed under his breath, stepping forward as if to grab Aisha's arm. But Sky moved faster. She lunged, planting herself between them with a snarl that echoed off the stone walls. Chaos erupted. Guests murmured in confusion, some standing from their seats, while others craned their necks to see what was happening. Denise's parents rushed forward, their faces flushed with anger. "Control that animal," Eleanor snapped. Aisha's voice trembled. "She's not the problem. You are." The words hung in the air, and suddenly the weight of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, hit her like a tidal wave. Her hands clenched the bouquet as she turned to face Denise. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, but the nervous flicker in his eyes betrayed him. "You never loved me," Aisha said, her voice gaining strength. "You just wanted what I have, my house, my business, everything I built." The crowd fell silent. "That's insane," Denise said, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. "You're being paranoid." "Am I?" Aisha's voice rose. "Then explain why I overheard you and your mother planning to take everything from me. Explain the papers you made me sign, the ones that would leave me with nothing if this marriage fell apart." Denise opened his mouth to argue, but Sky's growl silenced him. "I trusted you," Aisha said, her voice trembling. "I loved you." "Don't do this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Not here. Not now." "Why not?" she shot back. "Because the truth doesn't fit into your perfect little picture? Because you can't manipulate me in front of all these people?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're embarrassing yourself, Aisha. This is all a misunderstanding." "No," Aisha said, looking directly at her. "The only thing I regret is not trusting my instincts sooner." At that moment, one of the guests, a man Aisha recognized as a family friend of Denise's, stood and cleared his throat. "I think we've heard enough," he said, turning to the crowd. "Maybe someone should call the police." The room erupted into whispers. Denise took a step back, his face pale. "Don't be ridiculous," Eleanor snapped, but her voice shook. Sky barked, sharp and commanding as though demanding attention. The room stilled again, all eyes on the dog. Aisha felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. "This wedding is over," she said firmly, her voice echoing through the church. She dropped the bouquet to the floor and turned, walking back down the aisle with Sky at her side. Guests parted like waves, their murmurs fading into white noise as Aisha focused on each step. Denise called her name, but she didn't stop. She didn't even look back. By the time she reached the doors of the church, her heart was pounding, but a sense of clarity had begun to take hold. Sky pressed against her leg, her presence grounding Aisha in the moment. Outside, the sun shone brighter than it had all morning, and for the first time in days, Aisha felt like she could breathe. She knelt beside Sky, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. "You saved me," she whispered. "You always save me." Sky wagged her tail, but her eyes remained focused on the church doors, as if still guarding Aisha from the danger within. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, and Aisha turned to see Kendra running toward her, worry etched on her face. "Are you okay?" Aisha stood, wiping her eyes and nodding. "I will be." And for the first time, she believed it. Aisha sat in her living room, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. The echoes of the wedding day still lingered in her mind. The gasps, the murmurs, the sharp sting of Denise's betrayal. But here, in the familiar walls of her home, surrounded by the life she had built, the tension finally began to ease. Sky lay at her feet, her body relaxed but her eyes still scanning the room, ever watchful. Aisha reached down, brushing her fingers through the thick fur of the dog's neck. "You did it," she whispered. "You saw what I couldn't." But as relief settled into her bones, anger began to simmer beneath it. Anger at Denise, at his parents, at herself for letting it get this far. She had been so desperate to believe in love, in the fairy tale, that she had ignored every red flag. And now she had to pick up the pieces. The doorbell rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. Skye jumped to her feet, ears alert. Aisha followed close behind, her heart pounding as she opened the door. Kendra stood there, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "You're alive," Kendra said, pushing past Aisha and into the house. "I've been trying to call you all day." "I turned my phone off," Aisha admitted, closing the door behind her. I needed some time." "Well, too bad," Kendra said, dropping a stack of papers onto the coffee table. "Because you don't have time." Aisha frowned, stepping closer. "What is this?" "Evidence," Kendra said grimly. "I spent all night digging, and I found more than enough to prove what Denise and his family were planning." Aisha sank onto the couch, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Bank statements, property transfers, legal documents, all carefully crafted to leave her with nothing if the marriage had gone through. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I can't believe I almost let this happen." Kendra sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't let it happen. You stopped it. And that dog of yours? She made sure you saw the truth." Aisha looked down at Skye, who wagged her tail slightly but kept her gaze locked on the door. "She's the only one I could really trust," Aisha said softly. "You trusted yourself too," Kendra reminded her. "You listened to your instincts. That's what matters." But Aisha wasn't sure that was true. She had ignored her instincts for too long, brushed off the warnings until they nearly cost her everything. Later that night, after Kendra left, Aisha sat alone with Skye, the documents still spread out across the table. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, she called her lawyer. The legal battle stretched on for weeks. Denise and his parents fought tooth and nail to deny their intentions, but the evidence was undeniable. They tried to paint Aisha as unstable, pointing to the dramatic scene at the wedding, but her lawyer dismantled their arguments piece by piece. Through it all, Skye never left her side. She sat quietly during meetings, her presence a constant reminder of the strength Aisha had found when she needed it most. When the final ruling came down in Aisha's favor, she felt the weight finally lift from her shoulders. She had won, not just her case, but her freedom. In the months that followed, Aisha began to rebuild. She focused on her business, pouring her energy into new projects and expanding her gallery. She hired more staff, gave local artists a platform, and even started a foundation to support women who had been manipulated or abused. Skye became something of a mascot, her story inspiring others to trust their instincts and stand up for themselves. But it wasn't just the business that grew. Aisha grew too. She learned to stop doubting herself, to trust her intuition, and to value her own worth above anyone else's approval. And slowly, she began to let people in again. One evening, as she was locking up the gallery, a woman approached her, a young artist who had been following Aisha's story. "You don't know how much you've inspired me," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I was in a relationship like that once, but I didn't have the courage to walk away. Seeing what you did, it's given me hope." Aisha smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle in her chest. "I didn't do it alone," she said, glancing down at Skye, who sat obediently at her side. "Sometimes you just need someone who sees what you can't." The woman knelt to pet Skye, and the dog wagged her tail, leaning in to the touch. As Aisha walked home that night, Sky trotting beside her, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. She was free. And as long as Sky was by her side, she knew she always would be. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and share this video with your friends. Write in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Watch other videos on the channel. There's a lot more interesting stuff.